The house on Grier Street smelled of iron and stagnant water. Arthur moved through the hallway with a forensic detachment, his heavy rubber boots squeaking against the hardwood. He was a cleaner, the man they called when the body had sat for too long and the architecture of the room had begun to absorb the occupant. The previous owner, a shut-in named Miller, hadn't just died, the report said he had settled. When Arthur reached the bedroom, he saw the stain. It wasn't a puddle of fluids. It was a perfect, charcoal-black silhouette of a man burned into the floorboards, but the wood wasn't charred. It was porous, honeycombed with millions of tiny, rhythmic punctures. As Arthur knelt to spray the neutralizing acid, his coverall sleeve pulled back. There, on the pale skin of his inner wrist, was a geometric mole. It was a perfect, raised hexagon, black as the stain on the floor. He touched it. It didn't feel like skin. It felt like the head of a screw. A dull, wet thud echoed from inside his own chest. It wasn't his heartbeat. It was a heavy, mechanical shifting, like a tectonic plate sliding into a new position. Then came the sound, a dry, splintering crack that vibrated up his spine. Arthur gasped, dropping the sprayer. His radius bone was bulging, pushing against the skin until the flesh turned translucent. He watched, paralyzed, as the bone didn't just break, it unfolded. It snapped into 3 separate, serrated segments that began to rotate, carving a new, non-human joint into his forearm. The pain was a secondary concern to the noise. From deep inside his ribcage, he heard a frantic, rhythmic scratching. It sounded like 1,000 tiny claws trying to map the interior of his lungs. "Not a virus," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking into a discordant, double-toned rasp. "A renovation." He looked back at the stain on the floor. The honeycomb holes were beginning to pulse, exhaling a thick, brine-scented mist that smelled of old death and wet limestone. His other arm snapped next, the elbow turning inside out with a spray of hot, forensic red. He fell to his knees, his own skeleton becoming a cage that no longer recognized his shape. Arthur dragged himself across the floor, his body a frantic percussion of snapping calcium. Every inch he moved toward the silhouette. His rib cage expanded with a wet, grinding sound, the bones splintering into a series of jagged, interlocking plates. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a construction site. He reached the edge of the honeycombed stain. Up close, the holes weren't empty. They were filled with a black, oily ichor that moved with a rhythmic, tide-like pull. As his face hovered inches above the wood, the frantic scratching inside his chest stopped. A new sound took its place, a low, melodic vibration that hummed through his teeth. From the largest hole in the center of the silhouette's chest, a single translucent eye on a long, fleshy stalk rose out of the floorboards. It didn't look at his face, it looked directly at the geometric mole on his wrist. The skin on Arthur's chest suddenly tore open, not in a jagged wound, but in a clean, forensic slit from collarbone to navel. His lungs, now coated in that same black oil, were visible, but they weren't breathing air. They were pulsing in time with the fluid in the floor. One of his new, serrated arm segments reached out involuntarily. It didn't strike, it began to interlock with the holes in the floorboards, pinning him down as his flesh began to fuse with the wood. "The blueprint," he wheezed, his voice now sounding like 2 stones grinding together. "I'm the infill." From the dark void beneath the floor, thousands of needle-thin teeth began to rise, lining the edges of the silhouette. The house on Grier Street groaned as the architecture itself began to tilt, the walls bleeding a thick, brine-scented salt. Arthur didn't wait for the cement of his own biology to set. The panic was a high-voltage surge, overriding the renovation, for one final, forensic act of violence. He slammed his newly unfolded arm, now a 3-segmented limb of jagged, obsidian-hard bone, into the honeycombed floorboards. The wood didn't just splinter, it shrieked. He used the serrated edges of his radius to saw through the pulsing, oily connective tissue that was trying to stitch his chest to the floor. Every movement was a symphony of agony. As he pulled, his ribs, now interlocking plates, grinded against each other with a sound like a car crusher. The black oil sprayed across the room, hitting the walls with a heavy, wet thud. The eye stalk hissed, retracting into the dark void beneath the wood, but the thousands of needle teeth rising from the silhouette snapped shut, catching the edge of his mutated bicep. Arthur screamed, a discordant, metallic sound that shattered the windows of the bedroom. He didn't pull away, he leaned into the bite, using his other clawed hand to reach into his own open chest cavity. He grabbed the central strut that was forming near his heart, a cold, vibrating rod of non-human marrow, and snapped it. The house shuddered. The brine-scented mist turned into a torrential downpour of salt water. With a final, desperate heave, Arthur tore himself free. He collapsed a few feet away, his body a ruin of leaking black ichor and exposed, shifting architecture. He looked down at his wrist. The geometric mole was gone, replaced by a jagged raw hole that whistled as he breathed. He wasn't human, but he wasn't infill anymore. He was a glitch in the renovation. On the floor, the black silhouette began to thrash, the honeycombed holes widening as something much larger began to push its way up from the foundation to reclaim the escaped material. He didn't reach for the acid. His mind had devolved past chemistry and into a raw, forensic panic. Arthur collapsed onto his side, his breath coming in wet, salt-stink hitches as he stared at the hole in his wrist where the mole had been. The skin around the wound was already beginning to crawl, the edges thickening into a hard, chitinous rim. He could feel it. The second skeleton was still deep inside him, a parasitic architecture that didn't care if the blueprint on the floor was broken. He grabbed a pair of long-nosed pliers from his utility belt, the metal cold against his mutated, serrated palm. He didn't hesitate. He jammed the pliers into the whistling hole in his wrist, his teeth shattering as he bit down against the agony. He wasn't looking for a splinter. He was looking for the root. He felt it. It was a cold, vibrating filament of obsidian, thinner than a hair but stronger than steel, anchored deep into his marrow. As he gripped it and pulled, a rhythmic, high-frequency scream echoed out of his own arm. The filament didn't come out clean. It began to unspool from his veins like a pressurized wire, dragging out clumps of black, oily tissue. As he dug, his own ribs began to buck, the interlocking plates trying to crush his lungs to stop the extraction. The house on Grier Street groaned in sympathy, the floorboards buckling as the thing below sensed the theft. He gave one final, tectonic heave. The filament snapped, and with it, a massive, translucent organ, covered in hundreds of tiny, unblinking eyes, was yanked through the opening in his wrist. It flopped onto the floor, quivering and weeping brine. The pressure in his chest died instantly. His bones didn't move back, but they stopped growing. He was a half-finished monster, sitting in a pool of his own cooling, black ichor. He looked at the organ on the floor. It was already starting to pulse, its hundreds of eyes focusing on the honeycombed silhouette, trying to find a way back home. Arthur didn't give the thing a second to recalibrate. He lurched over it, his newly segmented leg moving with the stiff, rhythmic precision of a piston. He brought his heavy rubber boot down with the full weight of his collapsing frame. The crunch was forensic, a wet, structural failure of cartilage and vitreous fluid. The hundreds of tiny eyes burst in a single, synchronized spray of black brine. A high-frequency shriek, too thin for human ears to fully register, vibrated the glass in the window frames until they spider-webbed. Under his soul, he felt the organ liquefy into a foul, gray silt that smelled of ancient shipwrecks and pressurized rot. The silhouette on the floor went stagnant. The honeycombed holes stopped pulsing, the black oil within them turning to dry, flaky ash in seconds. The house on Grier Street let out a long, creaking sigh, the atmospheric pressure finally equalizing. Arthur slumped against the wall, his breath a rattling, double-toned whistle. He looked at his hand. The three-segmented bone was still there, the skin stretched tight and translucent over a limb that would never fit in a sleeve again. He had stopped the renovation, but he was left with the ruins of the architecture. Through the shattered window, the morning sun began to bleed into the room, hitting the silt on the floor. The gray dust didn't sit still. It began to form tiny, geometric patterns in the light, a new, smaller blueprint already mapping out the dust motes. Arthur didn't just collapse. He detonated. A raw, forensic rage boiled up through his distorted marrow, a rejection of the geometry that had tried to claim him. He swung his mutated arm, the three-segmented, obsidian-hard limb, and it cut through the air with a rhythmic, whistling hiss. The serrated bone caught the heavy oak dresser, and the wood didn't just break, it unspooled. He hacked at the furniture, his movements jagged and frame-skipping, turning the room into a whirlwind of splinters and torn fabric. He wasn't just breaking things. He was deconstructing the architecture of the house that had tried to host his death. He turned to the wall, his claws digging deep into the plaster. With a tectonic heave, he ripped away a massive section, exposing the lath and the dust-choked insulation behind it. He didn't find wires. He found more of the honeycombed rot, the black oil already drying into gray silt within the very bones of the house. "Liar!" he roared, the sound echoing in his chest plates like a hammer on an anvil. He lunged at the bed, the clawed radius of his arm shredding the mattress into a cloud of white batting that looked like salt spray in the dim light. He kicked at the floorboards, his heavy boots smashing the ash-filled holes until the wood was nothing but gray powder. The anger was the only thing keeping the salt stink at bay. He stood in the center of the wreckage, his chest slit heaving, black ichor dripping from his serrated elbow onto the ruined carpet. The room was a graveyard of broken logic. As his breathing slowed to a rattling whistle, he saw his reflection in a shard of the broken mirror. The man was gone. In his place stood a jagged forensic glitch, a creature of sharp angles and hollowed-out rage. He looked at the open wall, at the dark, silent space between the studs. Something moved in the shadows, not a monster, but a flicker of code written in the dust. Arthur didn't bother with the door. He stepped through the jagged gap he'd torn in the bedroom wall, his three-segmented limb clicking against the siding like a harvesting machine. He dropped to the pavement, the impact absorbed by the non-human joints in his legs with a heavy, rhythmic thud. The street was bathed in the jaundiced light of a suburban morning. A neighbor was at the end of a driveway, frozen with a garden hose in hand, the water splashing uselessly against a sedan. Arthur didn't hide. He stood in the center of the asphalt, his chest slit pulsing, the black ichor on his serrated arm beginning to harden into a forensic, obsidian glaze. The renovation had failed to claim his soul, but it had succeeded in rewriting his purpose. He looked at the telephone poles, the rows of houses, the neat, jurisdictional lines of the neighborhood. To his new eyes, it wasn't a community, it was unrefined material. He could see the structural weaknesses in everything, the points where the bone should snap, the places where the flesh was too soft to resist the new geometry. He raised his clawed arm, the obsidian-hard bone catching the sun. The high-frequency vibration returned to his marrow, but this time, he was the one broadcasting the signal. "It's time," he rasped, his voice a mechanical grind that carried down the block. "To fix the architecture." He began to walk toward the neighbor, his frame-skipping gait leaving rhythmic, honeycombed punctures in the soft morning asphalt. He wasn't a cleaner anymore. He was the lead auditor, and the entire world was overdue for a renovation. As he reached the edge of the driveway, his chest plates unhinged, revealing a row of needle-thin teeth that vibrated with a hungry tectonic hum. The neighbor didn't even have time to drop the hose. As the water pooled at his feet, Arthur's body lurched into motion, a frantic, frame-skipping sprint that bypassed the logic of human physics. Each stride left a rhythmic, bone-deep crater in the driveway. The hunger wasn't in his stomach. It was in his marrow. His new interlocking chest plates ground together with a sound like an industrial shredder, demanding the biological fuel needed to power his renovated architecture. The man finally broke the paralysis, turning to bolt toward his garage, but he was moving in a low-resolution world while Arthur was operating at the speed of a high-voltage surge. Arthur's three-segmented arm lashed out, the serrated bone whistling as it cut through the air. The neighbor's scream was a thin, forensic pitch that died the moment Arthur's obsidian-hard claw hooked into his shoulder. The weight of the beast brought the man down hard against the concrete. Arthur stood over him, his silhouette a jagged, non-human glitch against the morning sun. The neighbor looked up, eyes wide and reflecting the hundreds of needle teeth vibrating in Arthur's unhinged chest. You're inefficient," Arthur rasped, the double-toned voice vibrating the man's very skull. "Too much soft tissue. Not enough structure." He didn't use his mouth to eat. Instead, his chest cavity gaped wide, the obsidian plates unfolding like a dark, ribbed tunnel. From the void within, dozens of translucent, eye-covered filaments surged out, seeking the man's pulse. They didn't just bite, they began to audit the man's skeleton, mapping the points where the new bone would soon be forced to grow. As the neighbor's body began to twitch with the first rhythmic snaps of a forced renovation, Arthur felt the black ichor in his veins glow with a toxic new heat. The hunger was being satisfied, one broken bone at a time. He looked down the street. So many houses. So much unrefined material waiting to be audited. The neighbor's soft tissue was processed in a matter of seconds. As Arthur's internal filaments withdrew, they didn't just bring back energy, they brought back schematics. Arthur's body buckled as the stolen biomass was integrated. His spine didn't just lengthen, it split into 3 parallel, vibrating columns of obsidian hard bone that tore through the back of his coveralls. His legs snapped again, the knees reversing and merging with a thick, chitinous tail that balanced his new, forward-leaning gait. He was no longer a man with a mutation. He was a growing geometric infection. He didn't walk down the sidewalk. He scaled the side of a 2-story colonial with a rhythmic, scratching speed that left deep, honeycombed gouges in the brickwork. From the roof, his new eyes, black pits that saw the world in heat maps of structural weakness, scanned the neighborhood. He saw a woman through a kitchen window, her heart a bright, rhythmic pulse against the dull architecture of the room. Arthur plummeted from the roof, his weight shattering the patio table below. He didn't feel the impact. He felt the requirement. He burst through the sliding glass door, a whirlwind of serrated bone and black ichor. The woman's scream was cut short as Arthur's chest cavity unhinged, now larger and lined with rows of teeth that had grown into jagged, interlocking gears. He didn't just kill her, he deconstructed her. As he fed, his skin began to slough off in gray, dry flakes, revealing a body made entirely of matte black plates and wet, translucent sensors. By the time he stepped back out into the sun, he was 7 feet tall, a jagged tripod of obsidian limbs. He moved with a violent, frame-skipping grace, his presence turning the suburban air into a thick, salt-stink fog. He turned his head, now a faceless, angular wedge, toward the elementary school at the end of the block. So many small, high-frequency heartbeats. So much raw material for a total renovation. Arthur pivoted his wedge-shaped head away from the school as the first rhythmic crack, crack, crack of small arms fire echoed down the street. The bullets didn't pierce him. They hit his matte black plates with a forensic ping, flattening against the obsidian hard bone before dropping harmlessly into the gutter. 2 patrol cars skidded into a blockade at the intersection. The officers braced behind their doors, their faces masks of high-frequency terror as they emptied their magazines into the 7-foot glitch standing in the suburban sun. Arthur didn't flinch. He stood perfectly still, his chest plates vibrating with a low, tectonic hum. His torso unhinged, and with a wet, mechanical cough, he spat the flattened lead slugs back onto the asphalt. They were coated in a thick, black ichor that hissed as it touched the ground. Inefficient, Arthur rasped, the sound now a distorted broadcast that rattled the cruiser's windshields. He didn't run, he warped. His frame skipped across the distance in 3 jagged, light-speed pulses. Before the lead officer could reload, Arthur was on top of the car. His tripod limbs pierced the roof like industrial drills, pinning the vehicle to the pavement. He reached down with an elongated, serrated claw and peeled the driver's side door back as if it were wet cardboard. The officer screamed, but Arthur's chest cavity was already open, the rows of gear-like teeth spinning in a frantic, hungry anticipation. As he hauled the man out, Arthur's body began to deform again. A second set of arms, thin, needle-like appendages tipped with hundreds of gooey eyes, burst from his shoulders to track the other officers. His tail thickened, splitting into 3 distinct stingers that dripped with a pressurized, brine-scented venom. The remaining police turned to run, but they were moving through a world of soft tissue while Arthur was a creature of hardened architecture. He leapt over the first cruiser, his new obsidian limbs leaving honeycombed craters in the street. The hunt wasn't about justice. It was about the collection of biological assets. Arthur pivoted his wedge-shaped head away from the school as the first rhythmic crack, crack, crack of small arms fire echoed down the street. The bullets didn't pierce him. They hit his matte black plates with a forensic ping, flattening against the obsidian hard bone before dropping harmlessly into the gutter. 2 patrol cars skidded into a blockade at the intersection. The officers braced behind their doors, their faces masks of high-frequency terror as they emptied their magazines into the 7-foot glitch standing in the suburban sun. Arthur didn't flinch. He stood perfectly still, his chest plates vibrating with a low, tectonic hum. His torso unhinged, and with a wet, mechanical cough, he spat the flattened lead slugs back onto the asphalt. They were coated in a thick, black ichor that hissed as it touched the ground. Inefficient, Arthur rasped, the sound now a distorted broadcast that rattled the cruiser's windshields. He didn't run, he warped. His frame skipped across the distance in 3 jagged, light-speed pulses. Before the lead officer could reload, Arthur was on top of the car. His tripod limbs pierced the roof like industrial drills, pinning the vehicle to the pavement. He reached down with an elongated, serrated claw and peeled the driver's side door back as if it were wet cardboard. The officer screamed, but Arthur's chest cavity was already open, the rows of gear-like teeth spinning in a frantic, hungry anticipation. As he hauled the man out, Arthur's body began to deform again. A second set of arms, thin, needle-like appendages tipped with hundreds of gooey eyes, burst from his shoulders to track the other officers. His tail thickened, splitting into 3 distinct stingers that dripped with a pressurized, brine-scented venom. The remaining police turned to run, but they were moving through a world of soft tissue while Arthur was a creature of hardened architecture. He leapt over the first cruiser, his new obsidian limbs leaving honeycombed craters in the street. The hunt wasn't about justice, it was about the collection of biological assets. The audit of the suburbs was finished. Arthur didn't look back at the jagged, honeycombed ruins of the street or the biological husks he had left behind. His new, many-jointed limbs clicked against the pavement with a tectonic rhythm as he turned toward the scent of the deep, the heavy, pressurized reek of salt and old death that had been calling to his marrow since the first mole appeared on his wrist. He bypassed the downtown skyline, moving through the industrial district like a frame-skipping glitch. Chain-link fences shredded against his obsidian skin, brick walls gave way like wet sand. He reached the harbor as the sun began to drown in a bruised, purple horizon. The docks groaned under his 10-foot, multi-limbed weight. Longshoremen dropped their crates, their hearts flatlining in terror as they watched a monolithic engine of bone and eyes stride toward the pier's edge. Arthur didn't harvest them. They were small change compared to the architecture he was heading for. He reached the end of the concrete, his faceless wedge of a head tilting down toward the black, churning water. The brine-scented fog rolling off his plates merged with the sea spray. "The blueprint is complete," he ground out, the sound vibrating the hulls of nearby ships. With a final rhythmic heave of his interlocking chest plates, Arthur launched. He hit the surface not with a splash, but with the heavy, forensic thud of a stone meeting the abyss. The water didn't reject him. It opened. The black ichor in his veins stabilized as the pressure of the ocean took hold, equalizing the tension in his shifting skeleton. He sank rapidly, his obsidian limbs rowing through the dark, his hundreds of eyes finally seeing the scale of the renovation waiting for him on the sea floor. By the time the harbor police reached the pier, there was nothing left but a floating slick of black oil and the smell of ancient rot. Arthur was gone, a silent, predatory ghost returning to the deep-sea grid that had designed him. The first survivor was a beachcomber named Elias, a man used to the forensic debris of the Atlantic, driftwood, plastic, the occasional dead seal. But the tide that morning had brought in something that defied the local biology. Nestled in a bed of rotted kelp were 3 eggs. They weren't soft or leathery like a turtle's. They were geometric, perfect obsidian hexagons the size of a man's head. Their surface was matte black and cold to the touch, feeling more like high-density industrial ceramic than organic shell. As Elias leaned in, the salt stink hit him, the heavy, pressurized reek of a trench that had never seen the sun. He reached out a trembling hand. The moment his fingertip brushed the obsidian surface, the egg didn't roll, it vibrated. Inside the shell, he heard a dry, rhythmic scratching, the sound of tiny, serrated bones already mapping out their environment. A faint, oily black ichor began to leak from a microscopic pore at the top of the hexagon, smelling of iron and ancient silt. Elias didn't see the geometric mole already beginning to pulse on his own thumb. He only saw the beauty of the architecture. "Found something," he whispered into the salt-heavy wind. From beneath the black shell, 100 tiny, gooey eyes suddenly opened, pressing against the translucent inner membrane to stare at their first piece of unrefined material. Elias didn't even have time to reach for a crate. As his thumb brushed the cold obsidian, the hexagonal shell didn't just crack, it detonated outward in a rhythmic, violent expansion. The egg was a pressurized trap. In a forensic blur, a cluster of serrated, needle-thin limbs exploded from the shell, latching onto Elias's chest with a sound like meat hitting an industrial grinder. Before he could draw breath to scream, the primary filament punched through his sternum, seeking the high-frequency beat of his heart. The pressure from the abyss, bottled inside the obsidian casing, unleashed itself into Elias's soft tissue. Blood erupted in a geyser, spraying the white sand and the rotted kelp in a hot, rhythmic crimson. His ribcage didn't just break, it was minced from the inside out. Elias's scream was a raw, gargling wreck of sound, his lungs filling with a mixture of his own thickening blood and the black, oily ichor of the hatchling. As he collapsed, the other two eggs sensed the pour of fresh biomass. They cracked open in unison, dozens of tiny, obsidian-hard claws skittering across the sand to join the harvest. They didn't eat him, they liquidated him. The beach was transformed into a biological crime scene. Bits of Elias, shreds of his flannel shirt, shards of white bone, and clumps of gray muscle were tossed into the air as the hatchlings worked with a frantic, frame-skipping speed. The brine-scented fog rolled in from the surf, masking the wet, forensic sounds of the deconstruction. By the time the tide began to retreat, the man named Elias was gone. In his place stood three small, jagged glitches, obsidian tripods with hundreds of gooey eyes, already vibrating with the rhythmic hunger of their father. They turned their wedge-shaped heads toward the rows of beach houses sitting on the dunes. So much unprotected architecture. Thank you for listening. I have many more as well as a collection of short stories on Amazon for you to check out.